I think that we're in the interest of respecting everyone's time. I think we're going to get started. So, first of all, welcome to everybody who's here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be with us and nerd out about housing a little bit. Um, our goal today, I think, is to give everybody lots of practical, easy to understand, but I think pretty game-changing information in a relatively short period of time. Provide plenty of time for questions and answers at the end, and then let y'all get back to your busy lives. Today we're going to be talking about a budget-neutral hack for affordable housing. We're going to be talking about how local public financing could unlock housing affordability in Madison and the greater Dane County area. So today we've got three panelists here. There's myself, Evan Bonsall. I'm a Madison resident. I used to live in Michigan, where I was a local elected official who worked a lot on housing. I also was a local planner, local government planner for a couple of years. And I currently work as a social studies teacher just south of Madison in Oregon. But I'll be kind of facilitating things today. But I'll allow Olivia and Grant to introduce themselves. Olivia, you want to get us started?
I'm Olivia Williams. I'm the executive director of Madison Area Community Land Trust. We're an affordable homeownership provider in the Madison area, Dane County. I also studied urban geography and gentrification for my PhD several years ago, and so I like to nerd out on this stuff. Grant?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Grant Foster. I had 2 terms as a City of Madison alder, worked on housing-related issues at that time, and now in my post-alder time, I'm still interested in housing and in particular affordable housing and what we can actually do about it here in the Madison area.
Great, thank you both. And we'll hear plenty more from Olivia and Grant in just a moment. First, I just wanted to start by talking about, why we're having this conversation, really why Madison Housing Week is happening, which is that there's a great need for affordable housing here in Dane County, not just in the city of Madison, but throughout our county. According to the recent Dane County Regional Housing Strategy report, which is linked in the slides here. I recommend people check it out. 1 in 4 Dane County households are currently cost burdened, meaning they're spending more than 30% of their gross monthly income on housing expenses. And that's concerning enough, but there's also a lot of inequality in access to affordable housing here in Dane County as well. Right, 44% of renters are cost burdened. 49% of Black or African American households and 47% of Hispanic or Latino households, and 35% of seniors in our county are cost burdened. And there's also a very deep need for affordable housing, with 12% of households in the county currently spending more than half of their income on housing, which is clearly not financially sustainable. And Dane County, according to the Regional Housing Strategy, is going to need to produce 139,000 new units of housing by 2040, which is not as far away as it sounds. That adds up to about 7,000 new homes that need to come online each year to address existing needs and also to keep up with projected growth. And of those 139,000 new housing units, Dane County is going to need to make sure that at least 35,300 new rental units are affordable at 60% of the area median income or below. So we're talking about fairly low income housing there. That's almost 2,000 new affordable units that need to be produced each year here in Dane County. So we're going to talk about some of the tools that we could use to get there, and then this budget neutral hack that we've promised to you all and how that could help meet that need. So I think I will pass it off to Olivia to talk about the tools.
So this is a quote from Madison's Housing Forward Plan that came out in 2021. It says, by using all of our financial and regulatory tools, we will work with partners to construct 1,250 new affordable housing units in the next 5 years, half of them for households earning less than 50% of the area median income. So this shows a goal for producing affordable housing. It says we're going to use all of our financial and regulatory tools. So I wanted to get into what that means and breaking down those categories. So, next slide. Next slide, Evan. Thanks. Okay, so what are the regulatory tools we have in our toolbox? One of the most creative things that the city of Madison has come up with in recent years is the downtown height incentives for affordable housing in Madison, which allows downtown developments to add 2 additional stories to what would be allowed in their zoning district if at least half of that new space includes affordable units that are affordable for 30 years. There's a recent example, the Olive Madison development that's utilizing this bonus, and they're reserving about 11% of their units to rent 40% below the rent of their other units. So that's an example of how that's getting used. And, it's somewhat limited in just geography of where it can be used, and just the amount of affordability that can be achieved with that kind of regulation. Another set of regulatory tools that I'm sure we're all aware of is zoning tools, things that make it easier to add more units in general. And we've seen this in the form of by right allowances for accessory dwelling units or ADUs, increasing density allowances and transit-oriented development overlay zones in Madison, and just general increases in zoning density. And there's loads of research out there showing the benefits of this approach, that with increasing housing supply, overall costs start to go down after a time. But there's part of the issue with this is it can actually lead to the destruction of older, more affordable units as newer, more expensive units are built. So the primary ways that many communities around the US ensure the production and protection of affordable units while they increase density through these zoning measures is to actually do other regulatory things that we're not allowed to do in Wisconsin, including inclusionary zoning and rent control and measures that protect renters from losing their homes. And so because these things are preempted in Wisconsin, we often hear this narrative of like we're doing everything we can. And that's part of why we're here today is there's some things that we think we can do that we're not doing yet. So let's go to the next slide. This is just kind of illustrating this a little bit more, that this is a graph from the Madison's 2023 housing snapshot using data from the American Communities Survey. And this data is already a few years old, but the point here is clear that most of the newer units coming online, which are towards the left of the graph, built in the last 10, 15 years there, are not affordable to the median renter. And the most affordable units are kind of in the middle, are 40 to 80 years old. And we often call those naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAH. And most of those older units are not protected in any way from redevelopment. And they're often actually targets for redevelopment and at risk of being lost, while units getting produced are often too expensive for the average renters in Madison. And as of this year, typical market rate new one-bedroom apartments in Madison cost between $1,700 and $2,000 a month. So this is just to continue to illustrate that there's a real need for more production of affordable units, even just to meet the average renter in Madison. So what's affordable in Dane County? These are numbers from WIDA this year. This is based on their guidance for units they subsidize and what rent levels developers can rent their units at. So we've been talking about the 60% AMI level. So for an efficiency, what's affordable to 60% area median income would be around 1,300, for a one bedroom around 1,400. And many of the affordable units that are getting produced are at this zone, but there's a real need for lower and lower income people to also have access to housing. And it's getting harder to produce units at 30% AMI or 40% AMI below $1,000 a unit. So financial tools end up being the primary path we have for creating affordable units that are not market rate. And it costs between $250,000 to $270,000 right now just to subsidize one unit of 60% AMI one rental unit right now in Dane County. And often these developers who are doing this kind of development are stacking many sources of funds. So there are federal funds that are distributed from the HUD, that CDBG and home dollars. Those are distributed via counties and cities and a little bit through the state. There are regional federal home loan banks. We have the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago. Often that's part of a capital stack if you can get that competitive chunk of change. And then there's low-income housing tax credits, which are, the primary way most of these units are getting their largest chunk of change. So there's some from the federal government distributed through WIDA at the state level. There's also a state LIHTC program that developers can utilize. So that's also distributed through WIDA. The shorthand for that we call LIHTC. And then you can also add in private donations or grants to your capital stack to help bring down the cost. We see philanthropists contributing to things like the Bayview Foundation development, for example. One of our biggest sources of affordable housing right now, though, is this naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAH. I think it's important to note here that this NOAH might also be lower quality. It's kind of the housing that people who can afford better might not want to live in, and it is ripe for redevelopment. And then at the local level, we have affordable housing funds. The city of Madison has a significant affordable housing fund. I think it was $20 million this year, which is significant, but also not really fully meeting the need. And then there's affordable housing funds, and a variety of other communities in Dane County. And Dane County has their own fund funded by tax levy or from TID closures, which is also property tax kind of revenue. And then there's TIF, tax increment financing, that can be added to a capital stack sometimes. But the one we're not really utilizing is local public financing. So that's why we're here today. And I will pass it to Grant to help us understand what we're talking about.
Great. So this is the hack, local public financing. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what that is and then get into really an analysis of a sort of typical project pro forma and kind of explain how this works. So right now, as you'll see in the pro forma, the financing and investor return costs for a typical new development really accounts for about 2/3 of the rent that is charged to cover those costs, and only 1/3 of the cost of rent is actually going towards operating expenses. That's partly in the sort of commercial interest rates that developers get for the 80% or 70 to 80% of their project. But then it's also largely about the private or the equity investment that's typically used, which often results in significant profits and is what sort of makes up the difference in the market rent that's charged. Meanwhile, cities, counties, and public agencies like CDA, for example, actually have one of the things we do have that's not been taken away by the state is access to very low cost financing. City of Madison, for example, has a AAA bond rating, and can typically get money, somewhere around 3 points lower than what sort of a commercial note would be. And just to be clear, this so because of that access to low cost financing, we could theoretically lower the rents needed to cover costs on a new development by 50%. And that 50% reduction is not in the form of the Affordable Housing Fund or other sort of local dollars that are raised through our tax levy. These are not dollars that would lead to increased debt service that causes problems with the budget. But this is literally just a result of using low-cost financing in lieu of sort of private equity investment. Next slide. So this is the real sort of meat and potatoes. I'm going to take a little bit of time just walking through here, and then I've got a couple graphs to highlight some of the same things. So we have across the top our 4 different scenarios. So market rate is a sort of these are all numbers, I should say. The numbers used in here I got from a local developer, and they are basically sort of current numbers in terms of cost of construction, market rents, et cetera. So the example that I'm using on the left says this is for a 53 unit building, a little over 51,000 square feet with assumptions of construction costs at $220 a square foot, plus the land costs and plus soft costs. So for this project, the total development cost would be $13.3 million. Staying in that market rate actual column as I go down, the 80% of the cost of that development, 70 to 80%. I'm using 80% here, but many lenders are now requiring more equity in order to lend. But at 80% loan to value on a sort of typical, at this point, it's around somewhere between 5.5 and 7. Or 6 and 7. I'm using 6.5 here. The financing costs of that is $13.6 million. I'm going to stay in this column and jump down. I've calculated the expected equity investment return based on market rents that are expected as part of this initiative. And so if you roll all of those together, it shows you the actual sort of lifetime total development cost, which includes the financing costs and the expected equity investment returns at just shy of $50 million. The next section really breaks this down in terms of annualized costs for the project. So the first line that says debt service, and I've broken up the debt service into a couple categories, and I'll explain why as we go through it. But basically, again, this was for a 30-year mortgage on that, on the amount that's financed. And so that basically gives you an annualized debt service. So that's covering the principal and the interest for this project at $809,000 per year for the first 30 years. And then I show for years 31 through 60, you've now paid it off. There are no more annual financing costs associated with that project. The next line says average annual debt service. So that's really just taking that full amount that it costs to finance the project and dividing it out over sort of the expected life cycle of this property. And that gives you on average about $450,000 per year. The annual operating expenses, which are an estimate really just based off of expected gross market rents, of around $440,000 per year. So that covers really everything, operating the building, repairs, replacing the roof as needed, property taxes, all that sort of stuff. And then the next line is essentially the difference between those numbers and what is expected to be brought in through the gross rents for these 53 units. And so that gives you a total annual cost. Again, that includes the returns of $1.2 million. Just to get an understanding of kind of where that money goes. So of that, in the next section it says where's the rent going. The total of that is just over $2,000 average rent. And so this also should say this, this development would typically include some number of efficiencies, a few 2-bedrooms, mostly 1-bedroom apartments, which is pretty typical these days. And so this is the average for the entire project, which is very close to the sort of the 1-bedroom expected rent for this project. And it shows you of that amount, a little over $700 of it covers the debt service. And so that's just the debt service through the commercial note. A little bit less than $700 covers those ongoing operating costs, and north of $600 a month of that rent is going towards the return for the equity investment. And just to get a sense of what that number means, so again, this is for a sort of a 1-bedroom. If you have 1-person household that is looking to rent this, that would put their they would need to make 93% of the area median income in order to afford the rent at 30% of their income. So you can see below that the current Madison area annual median income is around $88,000. So this 1-person household would need to make $82,000 in order to cover the rent at 30%. I also show the AMI for a 2-person. So if 2 people split this 1-bedroom apartment, that they could actually make, together, they still need to make that same amount of income. And so that lowers the AMI for that household, for that 2-person household, down to 82%. So that's at market rate. The next column is something that doesn't exactly happen, but it's helpful to understand apples to oranges. So in this scenario, we have the same total development cost at $13.3 million. In this case, we're supposing that we finance the entire cost of the project with a commercial loan. That doesn't exactly happen because no one's going to give you all of the money for it if you don't put anything down. But it shows you what the cost of financing would be if you did finance it all of it, and not have equity investors. And this is a scenario that you could imagine if you had public financing that were provided to a developer for 100% at 6.5%, then your total financing for this project would be $17 million. Again, added together brings you to 30. And you can see the annual costs for this model, slightly higher debt service since you're covering 100% of the costs, but you end up not needing to pay the $364,000 per year in returns. And so basically this alone drops the rent from $2,058 down to $1,484. And again, you can see the equivalence of what the sort of AMI equivalents are for a rent at that level. The third column is a hypothetical public financing where instead of financing the entire project with a 6.5% sort of commercial loan, we use let's say the city of Madison, again, I said AAA, current municipal bond rates for a 30-year note, about 3.5%. So you can see now we would save, $9 million on the financing costs just by that lower interest rate. So total project costs, including financing, comes down to $21 million. And if you jump all the way down to rent per month, we've now lowered, and this covers the cost of construction and financing, as well as operating costs, down to $1,251 per month, which is below 60% AMI for a 1-person household, and even down to 50% AMI for a 2-person household. The last model is very similar. The only difference is instead of a 30-year note at 3.5%, this is sort of the typical way that the city of Madison borrows money, which is generally on 10-year notes, which you get an even better interest rate on, but obviously you have to pay more per year. But that lowers the interest cost down to $1.8 million, total cost down to 15, and all the way down to the rent per month. We're now getting to a rent level at $1,085 per unit, which again covers the full cost of construction and operating costs. And that brings the AMI for that 1,085 down under 50% even for one person, and close to 40% for a two-person household. Next slide. So same information, just to reinforce a little bit graphically. So on the left, this is the market rate, and this is really, this is the total financing cost. So you can see on the left with the market rate, you have, again, that 6.5% note, 80% loan to value, plus the expected equity investment returns. For the red bar, this is that scenario 2, where we've got 100% of it financed at that same 6.5%. The public financing number 1 with the 30-year bond, and the private financing number 2, the 10-year bond. Next slide. And this is, again, very similar information, but this actually shows the total expected rent costs and which portion of those is covering which portion of the costs. So on the bottom is the blue bar. That's the operating costs. As you can see, the assumption is it's the same operating costs across the board. The debt service in red varies based on what we've run through a couple times now. And then the green portion is the expected equity investment return. And Olivia will, so this hopefully shows the amount of rent reduction that's possible simply by using a different financing source, and that financing source being essentially municipal government that has access to low cost financing. And then Olivia is going to talk through, or this slide, I'll cover this one. So this is, again, essentially the same information, but we've simplified it to show you $1,500, and I think that's that scenario 3, or the scenario 2 actually. Could you go back one slide, Evan, just to confirm this? Yeah, so we've really just used, again, a very conservative number. So this 1,500, this is just simply removing the equity investors and financing the entire project at a 6.5% rate. So you can go forward again. So that's the difference between the $2,000 and the $1,500. As we talked about, if we actually take advantage of a municipality's ability to bond, that number could drop even lower. So this is sort of the primary benefit of this model, is that your starting rent can be much lower to cover costs. But there are a few other benefits that come along with this as well that Olivia is going to run through.
Passing to me right as the F-35s are flying over. I'll say I just saw something in the chat. I'll say one of the assumptions in these calculations is that we keep the developer fee the same in there, so that whatever kind of profit just from the development is kept the same. Operating costs are covered. This is an at-cost model that also may pay back and pay for staff time that is required, to do these kinds of projects. And we really kept this pretty conservative. So this image is showing that if we just eliminate equity investors and do a 6.5% 30-year mortgage on the whole property, what we get, so if you line up all the tenants and sort of pretend they're standing all next to each other, and their rents get added up across this graph going from side to side, the area here is like the total rent. So in a market rate scenario, our first scenario, say they're all paying about $2,000. So that total rent, the gray chunk is going just to investor returns over the life of the building. Next, click once. So that's that. If you go back one. So the light blue there is the at cost. If you just take that out, they're all paying $1,500. So that's the cost threshold, including that developer fee, including operating costs and all those things. Next slide. So another thing you can do with this, another benefit of this kind of model, is cross-subsidize rents with each other. So in this scenario where we take out equity investors and we have a 6.5% interest rate, there will be some profit, is what we're calling it here in brown. This is like equity investor returns that it's just not part of the equation. It's not needed. So that brown, we're just taking out that chunk of money. But we can still, I mean, if you wanted to on this type of building, you could still charge market rate rent around 2,000 for half the tenants, say, and that's the green, this kind of extra money, this like kind of profit that gets added on there. And you could take that green rectangle and move it over for where the red is and actually reduce the rent for half of the other tenants. So you could have half paying 1,000 and half paying 2,000. And that way you have some market rate units, you have some more affordable units. And go to the next slide. If you spread this out further and you have, rents at many different levels, you could really think of this as spreading across the income spectrum. So if you have tenants, on the left side that are lower income, maybe 30% AMI, and they need to find rent at about $700 a month, you can cross-subsidize that to market rate, and you can do this at these many different levels. So you might have some foregone profit there, but on the whole, this can still pencil out. Next slide. So another benefit, a thing we could do with this model is layer this with the subsidy, from tax credits, from affordable housing funds, from private philanthropy, wherever it's coming from. If you layer a little bit of subsidy in there, you can reach lower rents on a big portion of the number of units. So in this case, we put in a chunk of subsidy, and we're showing how you can get to that. Click again for me. 30% AMI rent at $700 a month for half the tenants in this building. And the other half are still below market rate at $1,500. So this is just an example. This is at cost, or with a little bit of subsidy added in. We can get much lower rents and, do it in a way that's actually much more impactful than our density bonus, much more impactful than any of the regulatory measures we can't use would be inclusionary zoning, so this is really deeply affordable. Next. The other kind of benefit here that we can think about is permanent affordability. So we can, use this model to sort of implement rent control just in this building if it's publicly financed. Whoever's financing that, the city, the county, the housing authority, they could implement restrictions to how much the rent could be raised within the building over time. So they could say, only raise it 2% per year or 3% per year, for example. That keeps those units permanently affordable, which is a lot different than tax credit properties, the LIHTC properties that are affordable kind of 30 years baseline. Sometimes they can get out of it at 15 years. If they get City of Madison funding added on, then they're required to be affordable 40 years. But these buildings last longer than that. And so with this model, there's no risk of losing the affordability in 30 to 40 years. Rents can be set to pay ongoing costs, maintenance, capital improvements over time. And then there's, this thing Grant was getting at of once you pay off the debt, if you can use a note or a loan that's a 10-year loan and then you pay it off, that reduces ongoing costs and you can spread that out over the life of the building. Kind of like paying off the mortgage on your house. Once it's paid off, your costs go down. So we can do that same thing on this type of development. And then, at some point the building will become old. It maybe needs a new roof, or maybe it needs to be just torn down and rebuilt. And at that time, if there are the proper restrictions on these kinds of buildings, or if they're publicly owned, that land can be held permanently affordable, and you could start over without having to pay new land acquisition costs. So just, start over and you're still at cost. Next, to Evan.
All right, thank you so much, Olivia and Grant. I think that you guys did a wonderful job of explaining how this could work in theory. And so I want to make sure we leave enough time for plenty of Q&A at the end here and discussion. But I just want to, before we wrap things up here, emphasize that this budget neutral hack, right, local public financing, is something that is being done in some places in the United States currently, right now. This is not purely theoretical. So we're going to just look at two real life examples real quick of how this is working in other parts of the country. So example number one that we're going to look at is in Seattle, Washington. Last year, Seattle voters approved a ballot initiative to create something called the Seattle Social Housing Developer. And so the Seattle Social Housing Developer is a city government entity that can issue bonds. They can also ask the voters for taxing authority. And their charge is to build affordable, publicly financed social housing. So in this context, social housing, the term social housing, is basically what we're talking about with this locally financed public affordable housing, right? So social housing is housing that's usually publicly financed, permanently affordable, and financially self-sustaining to at least some degree, where you have cross-subsidization of rents going on, like Olivia and Grant were talking about. And the authority that the Seattle Social Housing Developer has is very similar to authority that other local government entities right here in Dane County already have, like the City of Madison CDA or the Dane County Housing Authority. And so the Seattle Social Housing Developer currently has plans to develop at least 2,000 units of permanently affordable social housing. And there's no reason that we couldn't do something similar here in Dane County. Just to take a look at what we mean when we say, affordable in the context of this Seattle social housing model, this little graph here illustrates a hypothetical plan that the social housing developer created for to illustrate how cross-subsidization could provide housing at different price points. Provide social housing at different price points without ongoing subsidy. So you can see here that over on the right-hand side, we have some units that are closer to market rate, kind of at the higher end of that workforce housing, 80 to 120% AMI price range. But there are still almost 20% of the units in this mix that are reaching those, very low income levels, 30% to 60% area median income. And on the one hand, we might look at this and say, well, the most of the units in this potential model are not deeply affordable. But I think there are a couple of things worth thinking about there. First of all, there is a great need, not only in Seattle or here in Dane County, but throughout the country for this lower middle price workforce housing. And secondly, we are still achieving in this, Seattle would still be achieving in this mix here, almost 20% low-income units, which is significantly more affordable and more impactful than anything that we could really hope to achieve through density bonuses or even inclusionary zoning policies. For example, the Olive Madison project that Olivia mentioned earlier, after a lot of negotiation and discussion and planning, achieved about 11% affordability. The second model that I just wanted to talk about briefly here is in Montgomery County, Maryland. And this is an example, I think, of how flexible this model of local public financing can be, and other ways that this budget neutral hack we're talking about can work. So in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., the county's Housing Opportunities Commission actually directly invests public funds into private housing developments. And this not only removes the profit motive that we've talked about earlier, but also allows for cross-subsidization of affordable units with market rate units in private housing developments. So for example, on the right there, you can see a concept illustration of a new apartment building in Montgomery County called the Laureate. This is a 268 unit building located near transit. So it's transit-oriented development built by a private developer, but the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County has invested millions of dollars into this development and owns a 70% stake. And they can realize up to a 5% return from that. But this allows 30% of the units in the laureate, so about 80 units, to be affordable at various price points between 50% and 120% of the area median income there in Montgomery County. They're able to do this because the Montgomery County Council allocated $100 million to this sort of public-private form of social housing in 2021. But it is worth noting that not only can this produce deeply affordable units down to 50% AMI, but it is also financially self-sustaining because the county Housing Opportunities Commission is able to cover their costs from these investments. So this is not an example of ongoing public subsidy to produce these affordable units. It's also worth noting that the Housing Opportunities Commission has acquired or built and price controlled a couple thousand moderate income housing units, both owner occupied and rental units as well. So to summarize what we've been talking about and get to an opportunity for Q&A here and some discussion. Local public financing for housing is a hack. We refer to it as a hack because it has several unique benefits. Development costs are lower. Rents can be calculated to cover costs without the need to deliver a high return to private investors. It can be budget neutral in the long run, while still providing some deeply affordable units through cross-subsidization. And as Olivia mentioned earlier, if you add in a little bit of subsidy, it can still be relatively affordable for a local unit of government to do this while providing even deeper affordability. And of course, these units that are produced through this model will be permanently affordable, unlike low-income housing tax credit housing that is not permanently affordable. And finally, if the county or if Dane County or the city of Madison or another local unit of government were acting as a public lender and actually investing directly into a private development, even if it's a private development, they can require income restrictions on some units. So with that, what about doing it here in Dane County? We would encourage folks to talk about it. We can talk about it a little bit here right now. We'd encourage you to talk to colleagues, coworkers, friends. Especially, we'd encourage you to contact your alder or your county supervisor to have conversations about how we could make this happen here in Dane County. And of course, you will have an opportunity to ask your county executive candidates tonight at 6 p.m. at the debate that we're hosting here through Madison Housing Week. We drew a lot on some of these other outside sources that are on this final slide here. When we were creating this presentation, if you're interested in learning more, we'd encourage you to check out the Social Housing in the United States report that came out in 2018. There's also an interesting New York Times article on the Montgomery County model that we just discussed, if you have access to the New York Times. And I also wrote an article called How to Actually Solve Madison's Housing Crisis, where I talk a little bit about this as well for Tone Madison last year. And Olivia and Grant both were instrumental in instrumental resources as I was writing that article. So with that, I would open it up for questions. If anybody's curious about anything we've talked about, doesn't quite understand something, or wants to have a discussion about anything we've discussed today, we would love to hear your thoughts.
It looks like, yeah, from Marcia. So it says, thank you. Support the concept of using the city's borrowing rate, but also interested in how you would apply the CDA's bonding authority to this model. So, it's a really good question. I think it comes up a lot. And I think a lot of people have some, the ideas about like what it means to bond. So I guess a few things to say about this. So, I mean, number one, this isn't actually your question, but I want to say it because it comes up. We can borrow that. I'm going to use the city of Madison because I'm the most familiar with it. We can borrow as much money as we want and have no impact on the levy. So maybe everybody on this call already understands that, but I just want to say it. We can't borrow all the money we want if we can't pay it back. So there's a real sort of financial issues with over borrowing. Also, whatever we borrow, because it does need to get paid back, the debt service is going to come out of our operating budget. It is exempted from levy limits, but it still has to come from somewhere. Again, this model is saying that is going to come from rents. So this is no sort of tax dollars needed to pay for the financing costs. And so then when you're talking about city borrowing, there are sort of different mechanisms, or the CDA sort of bonding authority. And basically the bonding is just the ability for municipalities or what are called agencies to, instead of going to a bank and saying, I want money, how much are you going to charge me? And here's what I'm going to give you in collateral. For a city, we have a rating. So Madison has a AAA bond rating. And so when we need money, we go and say, okay, we're looking for $10 million for 10 years. And it goes out to the market and people, sort of bid on that. And that's how we get $10 million at a time. And so the way we actually get money, it funds all of our capital projects and expenditures. And we just really borrow it as we need it based on what's getting spent in these programs. So when we have build a new library that costs $30 million, we're not actually going and getting like a bond for that project that we borrow all at once and then have to pay back to people that bought those bonds. It's just, again, part of our overall expenses. And as money gets spent to build that project, it's coming out of our reserves. And as we need more of it, we keep going out and getting more money essentially through this bonding authority. CDAs works exactly the same. The only caveat is that agencies typically pay a little bit higher interest rate because they're not quite as safe as an actual city. So in this case, and I have had conversations with the city financing director around this, and basically in this case, CDA could borrow the money themselves and pay, a somewhat higher rate, or it could be the city of Madison using our sort of authority to get that same money and then pass it through the CDA. So big picture, it sort of doesn't matter. And whether it's the city or a housing authority or some other agency, both of them or all of them have access to money at a much better rate than a private developer has from a private lender. Sabrina, looks like you got your hand up.
Hey there. Thank you for this great discussion and all the conversations I've had, especially with Olivia and Evan and you too, Grant. And my lights keep turning off, but such is life. I just wanted to ask, so before I was older, I felt like I might have asked this question in some form, but I'm not sure. But I know that LIHTC expires at that 30-year mark. And then I missed the part about how and why it can expire like 15 years sooner. But is Madison staggering? Like, are we going to have like a wave of properties expiring all at the same time? Or is there some I don't know, some work to ensure that that's not happening? Because I actually did have a friend talk to me about their rent going up, and the property manager talking, it seems like they were saying that they were in a situation where LIHTC was expiring and their rent was going to come up.
I can say a little bit, Sabrina, that it is a real concern that I know CDD has been, tracking kind of where are the ones that are about to expire. I think one or two buildings have already recently expired, and it was an issue. So that would be, I'm not going to be the expert on it, but I know like Lynette and other folks in CDD have been kind of tracking on that, and there's limited tools, to deal with it once it's happening, but I know they are trying.
I mean, another way of saying is, I mean, this basically the city or county have zero control over LIHTC projects that happen. The only caveat is, for a project that wants or needs additional city or county funding to add in to make the project happen. If the city and county don't invest in it, maybe the project doesn't happen. But those projects can happen and often do completely independent of local financing. And then so the expiration terms are literally just set at whenever the thing was built plus the affordability term. So yeah, there's no like, kind of master organization that's saying, hey, let's make sure that we stagger these things so they don't all expire at once. And so when conditions are ripe and LIHTC is available, some stuff gets built, it's still not enough. And if a lot of it gets built at one time, it's going to expire at the same time.
Gotcha. Thank you.
We got any other questions? Things people are curious about?
Well, I have another question, but I was trying to
Sure.
wait. So what
Yeah.
about our immediate neighbors like Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois? Are there other projects that are closer by that anyone might have in mind? Especially, it's like, for example, I have been following a project not close, but in Oakland, where one of the founders or a woman who was in the Black Panther Party created Blank Panther Apartments, I think in Oakland. And that's like a really, really dope project, especially for the folks that it end up serving. And I think the city of Oakland did, are part of the project, but she raised a considerable amount of dollars. But I'm always looking for more similar projects to my long-term ideas. And so if there's something that stands out that anyone is aware of our neighbors that I can go drive to see, that would be helpful. But I know how to find y'all, so no worries.
Well, this doesn't really answer your question, but I think it's worth stating. So, one of the things that some people might think, oh, well, I don't know, it sounds interesting, but like, do we really want the city getting into the business of creating housing or something? I mean, that, just to be clear, that does happen, has happened. The only real difference, so CDA is a good example. The main difference is that they are leveraging money from the federal government to sort of create this subsidy. But the act of developing a property or redeveloping a property, doing the construction, doing the operations, all this stuff, these are things that the city of Madison and slash CDA, and many other local governments and agencies have experience in, do all the time. So there's really nothing particularly wild about a local unit of government developing buildings or developing residential units. The only difference is on this financing side, and just simply taking stock of the fact that the local governments and agencies have this incredible access to low cost money. And if we would leverage it more, we actually could produce these apartments at these rent points without that federal dollar. So there's really nothing standing in the way. Again, I'm going to use City of Madison because I'm most familiar. Y'all could add $10 million, $20 million in the next year's capital budget and move forward with this in a way that pays for itself. The only thing that we really need are some level of staff capacity, and it's not very high, to organize this program and carry it out. But as Olivia mentioned in the beginning in response to a comment in here, these assumptions leave in the developer fee. So, in this model, the estimated developer fee is $500,000. That's not part of the sort of the return on investment. That's for the equity investors. The developer profit in this is left in there. And so that's actually available for the city to take and or the county to take and to pay for the staff that is required to do this development work. So yeah, it's really not it's not a wild concept, or nearly as wild as it might seem.
Yeah, and I would just add to that that the reason that we focused on in the two examples we talked about were in Montgomery County and Seattle is because those are a little bit more in the advanced stages. I mean, Seattle social housing developer is in a more advanced planning stage. And Montgomery County has been doing their, direct public investment model for several years now, right, since 2021. It is worth noting, though, that here in the Midwest, the city of Chicago recently approved over $1 billion of bonding to support social housing development. So sort of what we're talking about here, but also other affordable housing initiatives as well. But it's still very new, just approved this spring. So that's why we didn't talk about that too much in this presentation. But it's interesting. It's worth looking into. I think we do have another question here from Kurt. Says, in order for the city or CDA borrowing to be below market rate, the bonds would need to be tax exempt for federal income tax purposes. But in order for bonds for housing to be tax exempt, there is the 20-50 or 60-40% rule. 20% of units must be affordable at 50% AMI, or 40% of the units affordable at 60% AMI. How would that affect the cross-subsidization and the idea of having a majority of units at like the workforce price level? Grant or Olivia, you might be able to tackle that.
I was just looking. So, I mean, what we modeled really is a building at 100%, 60% AMI. And that's without
the cross subsidy.
That's without cross subsidy. So that's at the 6.5% interest rate covering the total development cost. So I feel pretty confident that we definitely fit that.
Yeah, which I mean basically allows the other, or if you use a 20-50, you could theoretically charge market rents for the 80% of the units as long as 20 of them are below the 50. And like Olivia said, we're already basically hitting. I mean, if you a 10-year bond, we get 100% of units at 49% AMI without any cross subsidization. So yeah, it's not a problem basically. Yeah, we've got 1 minute to 1, so I definitely have to run and get back to my day job as well. Looks like Sabrina's heading out. Really appreciate everybody coming today, and as Olivia put in the notes, we'll send out PowerPoint to everybody that signed up, and certainly available for questions via email, etc. Maybe we can put our contact info in that email as well.
Thank you so much. That's been fabulous.
Well, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Thanks for everybody's time.